quadrants are simply what's going on in a single person on the inside, over here, on the left, so what's going on inside your head, and in the top right, what's going on between yourself and the rest of the world, so your behavior. So the inside and the outside. And then the bottom two quadrants of this diagram are essentially, well, what's going on for us as a collective? So what's going on amongst us as a group? In the lower right there, left rather, in terms of what's our culture, and on the outside, what's our structure, and how do we see all that when we're working together as a group of people? So he's looking at the inside and the outside of us as individuals and as a collective. So that's it for the theoretical dump. But just, I'll take you to the next slide here. So another colleague of mine by the name of Marilyn Hamilton thought, well, that would be an interesting way to actually look at the city, and the city as a phenomenon. So if we look at the city, in the top left-hand side, we have, look at you scooting up the wall with a big smile on your face. That's okay. Can the folks at the back hear me then? I'm getting thumbs up from midway, thumbs up, there we go, okay. Thank you. All right, so on the upper left there, imagine the voice of the citizen in the city. And Antoine here is wearing that hat this afternoon. On the upper right is the voice of the city manager. So imagine the institutions in our cities that regulate our cities. So whether that is City Hall, and Don Iveson is going to be wearing that hat when he arrives. He's going to have a fun time catching up, isn't he? And we also have, in the city manager hat, we could also throw in there things like school boards, health institutions, so those public entities that are looking after us on our behalf. On the bottom right, we have the people that physically go and build the city and develop it. And Bard Golightly is here wearing that hat, and I'll introduce him in a moment. And then there's the civil society hat, which is groups of people that are working on our culture, etc. And Eva is here wearing that hat this afternoon. Wish I could get this mouse to work over here. Okay, so Don is wearing the hat of the city manager when he arrives. Yes? Oh, he's not going to, well then we'll just cut him off. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I hadn't heard that. So thank you, Alex. I appreciate that. So we'll cover off Don's voice here as city manager. Another city manager, and I maybe just fill in for this, would be when you play the role of a professional planner and you run the planning and development department like I have done. So I think if someone had to not be here today, this is a good one. So I will fill in for Don, okay, because I've played that role in my life before. Okay. Bard, and when we get into the discussion, I'm going to let these folks tell a few stories and they can tell us a little bit more information about what they do. But Bard currently is the Chief Operating Officer of Christensen Group of Companies in Sherwood Park, so in the Edmonton area, for those of you that aren't from Edmonton. Whoops. Sorry. Here we go. And Eva, on my far right, is the managing producer of Catalyst Theatre. So she lives in a whole other world than Bard and I do in the business of physically developing and building a city. And then we have Antoine, who is an entrepreneur and a former Hindu monk. And Antoine this afternoon is going to be wearing the hat of the citizen who uses public infrastructure. So this is the frame with which we would like to offer a view into looking at the city. Now, typically in a panel discussion, I blew a panel up last Friday with the Public Institute of Professional Planners in British Columbia, and we actually got rid of chairs and did a whole bunch of crazy stuff. So we're not going to go that far today. But the proposal I made, and that these folks have graciously accepted to go on the journey with me, is very typically when we talk about public infrastructure, we have the two boxes on the far right talk. We'll have the people that physically build the city talk about what their role may or may not be in the actual physical installation of public infrastructure. And of course, we have our public institutions, our city managers, that also are looking out to make sure that they're putting it in, it's put into a right standard, and to what purpose. Very, very, very rarely do we actually include in that conversation citizens and civil society. So this afternoon, what we're going to do is the four of us, wearing these four hats or these four voices of the city, are going to have a conversation that none of us have ever had before about public infrastructure. And all four of us are just going to sit at the table, and we're going to use the microphone so you can hear. We're going to have a bit of a conversation about public infrastructure while you watch, so it's kind of like we're in the fishbowl and you're looking in on us. We have no idea exactly where this conversation is going to go. After a little while, we are going to invite you to ask questions of us and participate in this discussion. So really what we're doing is we're going to have a conversation about public infrastructure, what it means, and what it means to a full range of what the city is, because that's what we are all in the business of doing, is actually building a city. So with that, I'm just going to ask Bard to begin, and we're just going to sit at the table here, as I said. So if you'd like to see better, there are lots of seats at the front, so make yourself comfortable. If you would prefer to stay at the back, if that's where you're comfortable, that is fine. And we're just going to enter into a conversation about what is the role of public infrastructure and see what happens when we have these additional voices in the room with us. Bard?
Thanks, Beth. As Beth said, I think the goal of this is to try to keep it an open conversation. So I thought about this quite a bit as considering this discussion, and you know, the typical conversation between a builder or land developer and the city manager or the civic infrastructure is of one of the city wants infrastructure. The city's budget is pressed, don't know how to pay for it, so they try to download the cost of that to the developers or builder. And that's the typical conversation, and it's one that's quite fruitless and just full of tension and full of the standard push me, pull me kind of thing. So I think that you know, we need to take the conversation past that. And I had a couple of thoughts. One of them is a real simple one, which is moving into a place of partnership or collaboration. As builders, we clearly recognize that civic budgets are very pressed. And if you think about the tax dollar from which most infrastructure is developed, except on the occasional P3 projects like the Henday was a partnership, but there is only one taxpayer. And it is my view that the civic administration are the ones that get caught holding the bag. So most of the tax dollar goes either federal or provincial, and then by way of the various funding mechanisms, money flows back to the city, especially when it comes to things like infrastructure. Not entirely, but. And so I have a lot of empathy for folks working in the civic environment, because they're trying to do a lot, and then now with infrastructure, they're trying to catch up with a lot that's been, for a variety of reasons, it could be argued has been let go for a lot of years. And they're doing it with minimal resources. And so typically, as I said a minute ago, they come to the builder and the developer, the land developer, and they look to find a way to offset or download some of those costs. What I wonder is if it's missing, though, is a way to collaborate and partner on the opportunity, or opportunities plural. So what I'm getting at is, one of the things that's near and dear to my heart is water. It's been said that 30 to 40% of water in most Canadian municipal infrastructures is unaccounted for, which means, my interpretation of that is, it means we're not really sure where it's going, and it, you know, the infrastructure is old, it's crumbling. Very likely a good piece of it is just simply leaking. But what if we could have a conversation going back to the head end of this and talk about water use. So I wonder if we could talk about ways to reduce both the inbound and outbound water use at the time of development, which then in turn reduces the load on the infrastructure, which also reduces the need for reinvestment. And then is there a better way to work together to do that? So it's been said, I'll draw you an example. You mentioned Sherwood Park, and we do develop in Sherwood Park as well as most of the Edmonton region. And in Sherwood Park, we had a conversation where I said to the city manager, look, if we put up a building that has low flow everything, which we do as a matter of course, to be honest, would there be an opportunity to try and work towards reducing the underground pipe and the infrastructure that's required to support that? Because if you think about it, that means less treated water is required inbound. It also means less handling of the water outbound. So it seems to me like a simple supply and demand equation that may not be that difficult of a conversation to have. And I think we're missing that. That was one of the thoughts I had. And the other thought that may be a conversation for a different part of this is, kind of looked at infrastructure in terms of almost, you know, a hierarchy of needs. And there's the basic infrastructure we need, but in order to get to where we have a quality of life or something like what Eva's championing, we need to make sure that those basic needs are met. And we're not always scrambling to try to meet those basic needs, so that when we do things, you know, I'm a builder. I mean, I believe that what we build is important, but what creates a quality of life I shouldn't be saying this as a builder, but the quality of life comes from the things in our community that create a sense of belonging and create a sense of an opportunity to stretch our mind and think about things and to meet people, which is going kind of back to what Eva does. So I have some thoughts around that, but I'll stop talking for now.
Okay. The hierarchy of needs sort of thing is something I've been spending an awful lot of time thinking of, that essentially when we talk about cities at all, we would not have them if we didn't have substantial public infrastructure. We need basic water to meet our needs. We need the engineering work that you folks do to have buildings and structures that are safe so that we can build more and more and higher to the point where we're 7 billion people on planet Earth, half of whom live in cities now. Like, the population growth is absolutely phenomenal on planet Earth, and it is taking place in cities, and it is taking place because there's public infrastructure that's there to support the growth of us, right? The other thing that happens is our innovation escalates radically when we live in places that are cities. And the larger the city, the more innovation that comes out of it. And all of that takes place, I believe, because of the basic public infrastructure that's there, whether it's roads and transportation systems or water supplies. And then there's public infrastructure that is well beyond those basic needs that we need as humans. And that may be one of the realms that Eva might be comfortable to talk about. But for myself, if I wear the city manager hat, I ran the planning and development department in Fort McMurray, so the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo, from 2005 to 8, right at the, well, I was going to say at the end, but long before the end, and the end of the last really big boom. And what was patently obvious to us when it came down to the basic elements of shelter and safe transportation and water supply was we were scrambling to get it done. But wearing the city manager hat on, it's our responsibility to make sure that the basic needs are met for all of these people that are arriving, and the industry that's arriving, and the infrastructure that it needs. So when I put that hat on, or I watch my mayor and council with those hats on, it's my job as a city manager to make sure we're getting the resources that we need, like the financial resources and the physical resources, to get stuff in the ground and on the ground to accommodate the people that are arriving. So I know in that job I felt an awful lot of pressure wearing the city manager hat to deliver, because there is only one tax dollar.
but the demand is coming because of some other thing, and people are arriving, but yet as a municipal level of government, we have to provide it, and we have a responsibility to do that. So there's an expectation of different levels of government probably in this too. But, and then you also want to build a place that is more than just shelter and pipelines, right? So that's another piece to it. So I want to check in with Antoine and Eva and see what your perspective is on the role of public infrastructure. And we can move this microphone in between Bart and Antoine.
Okay, well, if my task is to speak from the perspective of a citizen, then I think a little bit of disclosure is required, because I have a range of different experiences that inform my perspective as a citizen that I don't know if is typical of an Edmontonian. But
maybe there is no one typical citizen, so maybe you're okay.
But I can appreciate some of the comments that Bart is making about how bylaws and policy create that are in some cases unnecessary, create limitations on what can be accomplished in terms of implementing effective choices around sustainable infrastructure. Some of my clients are developers. Some of my clients are also municipalities, so we see some of that. That informs my perspective. I also lived in Europe for about 10 years, so in about a half dozen cities. So coming back to Canada, it's a very different context. And so like that, I think is a very visceral part of being a citizen, living in a Canadian city as opposed to living in a European city, having access to U-Bahn stations every 200 meters compared to having just one LRT line that goes through the city, and having such a predominant dependence on vehicles in a city like Edmonton. There's a strong contrast there. And then also looking at the form of European cities that evolved around other types of economies in different eras. You have these very vibrant central parts of the city where people come together, and there's open markets and buildings that open up onto the street where commerce is happening, and there's a lot of activity and a lot of social interaction, whereas in a city like Edmonton, we don't see as much of that. So there's a lot of contrast, and in my experience, I've developed a perspective of a city as a city being like an organism. So every city, just like any organism, has certain inputs and certain outputs. So as citizens, as individual organic modules within the organism that is the city of Edmonton, for example, we have needs for water and food and heat and power and defense, security, and then we have modern needs that evolve for specific types of transportation and communication infrastructure, and all of that. These are all different networks or systems that allow the urban organism to function. And so there's a certain relationship between the urban organism and the environment that it exists within. And in this case, Northern Alberta is basically like the host of this collective organism that is the city of Edmonton. And we pull in inputs in the form of water through the North Saskatchewan River, and in the form of all kinds of goods that come to the city through complex supply chains. And we pull in power through coal and power plants that exist within and outside of the city. And then we have outputs, just like humans do. We eat and we drink, and then we have our outputs. So does the city. And those outputs go into the air, and they go into the rivers. And so, as an organism in the context of Northern Alberta, if we look at that relationship, we can ask ourselves, what is the nature of that relationship? Is the urban organism an entity that nourishes and makes abundant the environment or the host that it exists within, or is it an entity that is detrimental? And I think that's the challenge. I mean, when we're talking about sustainable infrastructure, there's the two aspects of sustainability. There's sustainability from the long-term context of how we exist in relationship to our host, and then there's also the other aspects that we have to deal with, that I deal with as a consultant on a development project, or as a real estate owner, and that is the realities of dealing with economics and political dynamics that influence how infrastructure is developed. So, yeah, I think, and then within the context of infrastructure, there are all those dynamics. There are the dynamics of meeting all the needs of providing for the individuals that exist within the city. And, yeah, so I don't know, those are some thoughts.
Well, I guess what's interesting to me is that even though professionally I operate in a really quite different field from the majority of the people in this room, we're actually all coming at this question from exactly the same place, which is the question of quality of life and what does it take in order to foster healthy and dynamic quality of life. I really liked that 4-square illustration you showed us, Beth, because it's such a clean way of talking about the fact that the balance and the mutual respect between those 4 areas is so critical to being successful in developing cities. And in answer to the question of what is the role of public infrastructure, my thoughts are kind of much more broad stroke and philosophic, I guess, in that I would say very simply it is to provide the physical bones that allow us all to fulfill our greatest potential as human beings. And that in doing so, what we have to be able to do is mediate very broad ranges of value systems. We have to know how to be responsive and how to have really effective and responsible ways of communicating with each other, and that can be extremely challenging. Civic governments or any governments have to find those ways of both eliciting and hearing and interpreting voices. We have to have a long-term vision of what we want to, how we want to invest and how we want ourselves and our children and our grandchildren and other generations to live. And we need to understand how to invest really smartly and in a streamlined way in public infrastructure so that in doing so, we're really leveraging the maximum possible willingness for human investment in our cities as well as financial investment. I would say that as somebody who works primarily in the arts and culture industry, that we are hugely dependent on the quality of the physical infrastructure that is available to us, whether that's by way of transit lines that bring our audiences to us, or the lighting on the streets that our patrons have to walk down in order to get to our venues safely. All of these things are so important to what we do, and so what I'm really hoping we can frame this conversation on is the fact that there is an incredible mutual interdependence in terms of how we all have to bring what we do to the table in a way that is really, really well balanced and respectful of those different views.
So I've noticed in my line of work when we're talking about what to invest or what's the long-term vision in terms of public infrastructure, that typically what happens is the developers and the city managers will squirrel away and go figure it out, or it might even be just the city managers, people inside City Hall or inside a health institution, because I'm broadening that sense of public infrastructure to be a lot bigger than just what like the corporation of the city of Edmonton, say, would provide. But I wonder in what ways, from your 3 perspectives, a city manager could behave in a totally different way to have full access to the wisdom that's in the city with the 3 voices that you bring in addition to those of the city manager. And when I say city manager, just so everybody knows, I don't mean Simon Farbrother at the city of Edmonton. I mean all of us that operate in those civic institutions as an entity that are the ones that are making the decisions, that we all collectively play that role as city manager. So when I say city manager, I just want to say that's what I mean. I'm not pinpointing a person at the top of the hierarchy, but So how could city managers do their job totally differently to more fully integrate the full needs of a city with respect to public infrastructure?
Well, I mean, there's an assumption in that question that the consultation with the public can draw out a broader perspective and more intelligence that will inform design and make it more effective, and so that planning is better adapted to the needs of citizens. And so the question, I guess that's the question, is how can that be accomplished efficiently? So, I mean, we've seen, in Edmonton, there's some interesting examples of initiatives that go about that consultation, of reaching out and meeting with the public to inform some of the planning process. And there's even, the city of Edmonton has this, what is this? There's a planning course.
Planning Academy.
The Planning Academy. Yeah, so it's a program to actually educate citizens about the planning process so that they can be informed and participate. When they get a notice in the mail that their neighbor's putting up a garage that requires a variance, they'll know what's going on. And also, you know, the concept there is to inform citizens of where the access points are in the planning process for them to give their input, for them to share their opinion, to object or to give ideas. So, I mean, I don't necessarily have an answer to the question, but just to frame it, those are some touch points that we can look at in terms of what is effective. And are citizens actually engaging productively in that conversation? Is the intelligence that's coming from the interaction with citizens, is it relevant? Is it being used? Is it helping to inform the planning process? And I don't know the answer. I've sat in a lot of those meetings, but I don't know to what extent the information that's coming back to the city is helpful.
If I could jump in on that, I hear what you're saying, and I think part of the challenge is that the conversation often happens when there's an issue at hand. As you point out, you get something in your mailbox, you see a sign up, LRT's going by my front window, or whatever the case might be. And I wonder if there's a way to have the conversation when there isn't an issue at hand. Because often these things are emotionally charged, and I would venture to say that whether it's people in, like myself, or in the industry where we touch this closer, or whether it's a person that lives halfway down the block around the corner, I think that there'd be some really good ideas out there. But typically we don't have the conversation until there's an issue at hand to solve. And so it becomes a lot more challenging. And the Planning Academy, I think, was a great thing in that it's a reach out to help inform people how the process works. I don't know enough about it to know whether it is a vehicle for exploring ideas and alternatives, and
yeah.
I don't think it is. But just to add to your comments, it's a thought.
Yeah, I don't think that's the function of the academy, but that is the function of the stakeholder meetings that happen around the MDP, that happen around the sustainability plan for the city.
So you're a citizen who just threw out an acronym.
Oh,
Way to go. Would you say what MDP is?
municipal development plan.
Okay.
Well, you guys should know that.
I'm impressed with your citizenry.
I'm not sidestepping your question, but I actually want to back it up
Okay.
just a little bit more, because one of the things that I feel is that, and it touches a little bit on what Bard was saying, is that we actually are not very skilled at having conversations in a non-confrontational way. And I have a 12-year-old and a 13-year-old, and one of the things that I really value about some of the things they're learning at school right now is that they're actually, I believe they are doing a good job of trying to teach them how to have good conversations. And when I talked about the need for strong communication skills earlier on, that's really what I was talking about, is how do we engage in conversations in a way where we are actually really listening, and where we have enough time to have those conversations and let them roll out and have a kind of evolution in our collective thinking when we're not always pushed up against these kind of deadlines. So I think there's also a kind of fairly fundamental cultural issue in terms of how we engage with each other, and it really kind of comes down to an approach to democracy, essentially. And the fact that we have a long way to go in terms of figuring out how to have ongoing long-term dialogue about issues that's not short-term issue-driven.
Yeah, that really resonates with me, because when I look at simply just inside my profession, so we've got, 905 professional planners across Alberta, Nunavut, and the Northwest Territories, and we perennially end up with this big conversation about the chasm between those that work for the private sector and those that work for the public sector, and how they end up in their actual work being in positions where they may work, say, for BARD, or they may work for the city, and then they have to negotiate, and there's always this confrontation. But as a professional institute, what we would like to do is give them a place where they can talk about, well, what is it that they actually share? So even just inside these two voices of the city, inside one particular profession, there's that, the conversation takes place or doesn't when there's some sort of conflict, but then there's a whole bunch of work to do to build relationships. Maybe it's even across all four of these voices, where we just change a culture to actually talk about stuff that matters, but not in a confrontational sort of way. I think there's huge value in that.
Yeah, and I think that as we keep going down the path we're on now, we are really kind of seeing a situation where there is greater and greater polarity in terms of values. So that process becomes even more important and is going to take longer with every decision we have to try to make, to get to some kind of mutually agreeable compromise.
Yeah.
I agree, Eva, and I've been thinking a lot about, what the end goal is, and going back to that kind of hierarchy of needs. I sometimes wonder if we haven't really got in touch with what the end game is, or the end goal is. And so, I've got a couple of thoughts on this. The first time I had the opportunity to travel to Mexico, just on a family vacation, I was extremely dismayed when I was walking on the beach and I looked at all the stuff that had floated up on the beach and all the garbage and it was, to be honest, to quote our mayor, sort of, is crap on the beach. And I thought, I was really disappointed because I was in this beautiful place. Then I realized, well, hold on a minute. Their basic needs aren't being met. They're sure as heck not going to be thinking about recycling. So I got to thinking about this discussion, and I was thinking, health and safety and that sort of thing is obviously some of the fundamental needs. And then, we need to have an economic situation where people can meet their basic needs for themselves and their family. I think maybe the environmental thing is then a place we can go, okay, I can take a breath and I can look at that. And then, we move to going back to what Eva was talking about, I guess maybe we're all talking about, is quality of life and those things that enrich our lives and allow us to grow. So this might seem really crass, but a friend of mine once said to me, not about this conversation, we were just talking about something else, and it was more economic, or our own personal finances maybe, and he said, well, he sometimes has this theory, if you take care of the luxuries, the rest takes care of itself. And it's an interesting point, because if we drive towards the things that create the quality of life, and I declare my bias because I know Eva, and my brother-in-law actually works with Eva, and that isn't enough, that isn't skewing my thought. What I'm saying is that those things are the things that drive our quality of life. So to me, is that a luxury? I'm not sure. But what I guess I'm trying to say is, if we strive for those things, then we have to build the foundation and the structure and the way of working together to get there. So all of a sudden, we're not all caught up in this ineffective noise. Maybe I'm being altruistic, but I just can't help but think that maybe, the end goal is not to build the Henday. We may or may not need the Henday, we can argue that if you want. But the end goal is to create a quality of life. And if it turns out we've just got to a point where we need the Henday, okay, whatever. But to me, the discussion stays down here instead of up here.
Yeah, I mean, and there's some aspects of that are, the question of whether our basic needs are being met and the role that that plays in considering things like recycling, it's an interesting question because ultimately our short-term and our long-term interests are in conflict with each other. Right? Because if we build infrastructure, we build systems that deplete the resources that we sustain ourselves on, then that is not in our best interest in the long term. The challenge is that a lot of solutions, like when we look at clean tech and we look at sustainable infrastructure in terms of environmental considerations, they require investment. They require capital investment. And the challenge that we face is that we have, the city of Edmonton, the city of Calgary, we have the province of Alberta and Ontario, BC, and nations. And so we collaborate together, but we're also in competition with each other for resources. So if one city decides to invest substantially into some kind of solution that will be in our ultimate long-term benefit, that may result in us being less competitive with other entities. And so that's an inherent conflict that we face, right? And that comes into play in terms of policy as well. It comes into play in terms of taxation, and really it's a question of we could solve every environmental, at least a lot of environmental questions using market forces if we were able simply to internalize the costs that are currently external. If we could charge a surplus on unhealthy food, that would help to cover the medical costs. If we could, have a tax on energy that pollutes the environment and use those proceeds to fund renewables, that could be very effective. But the problem is that would create an environment that is not favorable for enterprise and ultimately would undermine our short-term revenues in the form of taxation. So it's a bit of a paradox, and even if we were very committed to ride it through and put our resources into long-term solutions and ride through the temporary intermediate consequences of that economically, we may find ourselves in a position where we don't make it to the long term. So it's a challenge, and for me, coming from an entrepreneurial perspective, because of that, there's this lack of balance where the true costs of the shortcuts, the true cost of the simple solutions to infrastructure that we sometimes turn to are not being considered. So we have this imbalance, and so for me, it's that much more important that we put strong emphasis on any solutions that we come up with that are or have the potential to be viable in the current economic situation. And there are many opportunities to explore existing technologies that are economically viable or could be with just a little push in the current context. And I think if we appreciate how far off balance the equation is due to the economic competition, and due to the fact that we don't have the ability, like even if we look at Kyoto, we don't have the ability to get everybody to agree to invest at the same time and create an even playing field. We don't have that ability. So if we appreciate that unbalance, then it becomes that much more important to jump on any opportunity that arises for economically viable solutions.
I'm curious about, from our 4 different perspectives, what public infrastructure does for us. So if I wear the hat as the city manager, I guess in a way I'm the one in particular of the 4 of us that's responsible to get that public infrastructure in place. And I'm thinking right back down to the basics of the pipes and lines that go into our homes and leave our homes and our businesses and our recreation facilities, like the clean water and the dirty water, right? Like there's that basic stuff, and then there's the basic transportation infrastructure. There are emerging kinds of public infrastructure that are around communications that may or may not actually be owned by the public, but it's definitely a public kind of infrastructure. So I think the city managers have a particular role in figuring out what's needed and putting it in place and then maintaining it. But I'm wondering what the perspective is from you three about what your role is in terms of like getting it and making sure we can sustain public infrastructure. Because it's not, I mean, it's a, if Don was here, he could list off all of the stats on how municipal governments are getting killed by the costs of public infrastructure, but
Can you put some parameters on what, when you're talking about public infrastructure, can you draw me a framework around what that includes and what that does not include? Because in my mind, public infrastructure could go actually probably quite a bit farther than what I suspect you're talking about.
well, and why don't we hang on to both, right? So with my city manager hat on, I'm gonna be thinking about roads, I'm gonna be thinking about water and wastewater distribution systems and treatment, landfill, kind of public infrastructure in terms of what we do with our garbage and that kind of stuff. And from a city manager hat, I probably stop there, and I might think about some other things, but it really doesn't go really far. But you may think of public infrastructure as being an awful lot bigger, and I think we should hold that too. Because it's not just what I see as an entity that has to go out and deal with it, right? My crews go out and repair the roads as a city manager, but what's your perspective? So what else do you see for public infrastructure, Eva?
Well, the reason I brought it up is because when I think about public infrastructure, whether it's on any like municipal, provincial, or federal level, I'm also thinking about programs and policies that really shape who we are and how we do things.
Okay.
So it's in addition, of course, to the physical infrastructure that you're talking about. So it's two really different places to be coming from in terms of the question you asked is, what the impact is on what we each do.
Well, and what municipalities choose to do often is a factor of what the policies and programs are, right? Like there's a program to do X, Y, Z, so everybody goes and takes the money to do X, Y, Z, even if their big goal isn't that, because we'll go, oh, there's candy. If we go and we eat the candy, municipal governments do that all the time.
Yeah, well, I guess the simplest answer from a kind of cultural perspective is that cities that have really elegant and effective physical public infrastructure are often cities that have very strong and vital cultural and entertainment communities. It doesn't always necessarily go hand in hand, but as I said at the beginning, we need to have that infrastructure in order to have the buildings and the spaces, the public spaces, the access to whether it's electricity or water to do what we do, and there's no way we can do it without that. So in my mind, they really go hand in hand. I mean, yes, you can create art and you can provide culture without strong public infrastructure, but it's a lot harder. And I think it's less enjoyable for our audiences and for the general public when they're struggling with those factors. I operate a building that doesn't have air conditioning, and it's a huge problem in the summer. So, just the factor of what is your level of physical comfort when you're trying to engage your soul and your brain in another kind of way is really important.
So I just want to check in with Bard and with Antoine, and then let's see what you folks think about public infrastructure, the role of public infrastructure. And if you have any questions in particular for any of us, just to get some ideas for you in your work, we would welcome that.
I'll just, a couple of comments, thinking about this question. It's actually, what sounds like a simple question is actually, is not. So I'm gonna take the easy way out and follow Eva. And that, I agree that the public space, the access to those things, is critical. And so, at the very least, one of my responses to your question is is in and around transportation. So, you know, you've mentioned cities in Europe, and I've had the privilege of experiencing some of those, Eva just recently did. And you can get around and you can get to those things fairly, fairly painlessly. And so, if one wants to partake, whether it's going to the market, whether it's going to see an arts production or whatever it is, if it's hard to get to, it's going to discourage. And I think too about community building, and I really believe that there needs to be an organic way to create community. And so I'll finish that thought with, you know, I think about my own mother, who's 81, I think, and she's not a joiner. So if we create ways through public infrastructure at times of an organic opportunity to meet other people and to interact with them, at about the 8th time, she'll actually say hello. And so if you try to force her into programming, it's not going to work because she just won't do it. But if you can give her the opportunity to have the public square, or maybe there's a performer, maybe there's a public Saturday market, whatever it might be, and it's clean, it's safe, I think there's something to that. And that, you know, the question then becomes who's responsible for delivering that environment. And I think that is partially, at least, infrastructure or public infrastructure. Just some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a delineation in terms of what is being managed directly by the city and financed directly by the city, and what is public or private. And so, but in terms of planning and design, everything has to be considered holistically, because the policies are going to affect how spaces are used. They're going to affect how people move around the city, and so. And I think that in developed nations we see that is taken into consideration. That city administration is not simply about managing the stuff that the city owns, right? But yeah, although we can easily get siloed into our individual departments and not have the synapses really to give us information about how our decisions and our planning, our projects are affecting other aspects of city life, socially, culturally, and in terms of basic infrastructure like transportation and energy. So, yeah.
Cool. So this microphone here moves, so I'm wondering if anyone has a question or a comment or observation that you would like to make of us. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Do you mind introducing yourself too?
I don't mind. My name is Travis. I'm an engineer at Associated Engineering. And I'd like to thank all of you for sharing your thoughts. It was very interesting. So my question is about talking about infrastructure and the built environment. And I guess a little bit more high level, talking about the policy that shapes infrastructure, specifically land use, and how zoning typically, while not necessarily, it does restrict form to a certain extent, but a lot of it is about how is land being used. So commercial, residential, industrial. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were from your different perspectives on sort of a movement away from the purpose of land to something like form-based land development. So where the thing that is restricted is what shape can the space occupy, and what form is prescribed to it, rather than what it is used for, in terms of allowing it to be flexible for many uses and to encourage mixed-use communities for future generations, rather than specifically saying this is strictly residential land.
I want to answer that.
Go, Eva, go.
Actually, recently in Edmonton, there is a shift toward a bunch of rezoning around that would basically allow for more arts activity to be happening in spaces that currently are not zoned for arts activity. And I actually believe that it is really, really healthy to mix it up within, within limits. I mean, we don't want heavy industry cohabiting in the same block with, I don't know, a studio that offers painting classes for young children or whatever, you know what I mean? But I think that the delineation between large tracts of land which are specifically about residents and separating that from other kinds of activity is really unhealthy. I love it when I go places where people are living in the same building, where people are creating, where businesses are thriving, where there's shops and restaurants. I say bring it on, like you find those healthy limits, but I think it's really important to have a dynamic environment, and also in order to create a lot of smaller hubs in terms of how we live as communities, so that there's a more kind of, smaller areas that are better integrated and balanced. And I'm not involved in development or urban planning or anything, so I don't have the language that most of you would have to express this, but from a kind of experience of what it is to live in a happy way, I would say that mix is really important, and we need to be going much more toward that.
Maybe I could add to that. There's I think I know a little bit about where you're going with that, and I've been very interested in what you would probably be more familiar with than me, which is the performance-based zoning and performance-based land use. And it's an interesting idea, and I like it in that, to have prescriptive, this piece of land shall be this or that, seems like there's no possible way that you can predict the future and know what might be needed or what might be adapted to. And then you have the tension point between that and an awful lot of folks' need for some sort of certainty, because I realize you were just drawing out a point to make a point, or drawing out an analogy rather, make a point. Yeah, no one wants kids learning art beside an industrial application. I talked to a guy the other day that will not live in an apartment where there is some commercial at grade. It's the first time I ever heard that. But then as he talked to me, I'm not saying I agreed with him, but I'm just saying it was an interesting perspective. He just doesn't want people, his concern was, if they build it like that now, what happens in 10 years when there's a new tenant in there and all of a sudden you've got, I don't know, I forget what he said, a tattoo parlor, which he didn't like the idea of, or whatever. So there's the question, what I'm getting to is, there is sometimes this need for certainty which drives a prescriptive approach as opposed to something that's more flexible. I think you sort of alluded to something that could serve us in the future and be adaptable. I'm not sure what those models are, but I like where you're going with it.
Go
I'll make
ahead.
a comment too, because, I mean, part of what I really miss about Europe is that, we could live basically anywhere in the city and walk out of our door with one of those little old lady shopping baskets with the 2 wheels on it, and go to the store and buy food for 2.5 days and walk back to the apartment. And you have fresh vegetables and fresh bread from the bakery. And so in a lot of Canadian cities, that doesn't really work. So, I mean, it'd be beautiful, in the neighborhood where I live and many neighborhoods in Edmonton, if there were, those little commercial spaces where people don't have to travel to the big box store to buy their food, and there's maybe a little cafe, and the neighbors could get together, and it'd be conducive to a lot of neighborhood interaction. That would be wonderful. And then the question is also, what is it about the way our cities are designed in North America that makes it that opening that little grocery store in our little neighborhood it's really hard to make that a viable business. And I think that has a lot to do with how transportation works in our cities, that we're so heavily dependent on the car. Because in order to have commercial space in a residential neighborhood that works, you need to have a good number of your customers that can come to your place without needing to bring their car and needing to have a place to park their car, because commercial spaces in residential neighborhoods create a demand for parking that can cause congestion and other kinds of problems. Like even here in Edmonton, we have White Avenue District, which is a very active commercial district, and there's residential areas all around White Avenue, and you know, there's parking issues in that area. So the question is, if you're going to have commercial installations in a residential area, what is it that's missing to make that economically viable? And some of the zoning that we see applied, it's if you create an area that is zoned commercially, then there'll be a concentration of commercial buildings in that area, which tends to attract retail customers, and that does become viable. Ideally, not always, but so, and there are still, in this city, there are still some areas where you have these very interesting little hybrid buildings that are in the middle of residential, across from a community hall, and downstairs is these little tiny commercial spaces, and upstairs is residential. And they're really neat buildings. They're really hard to finance because nobody knows whether they're residential or commercial. And but they're not that vibrant. You know, it's not like you go in there and you're guaranteed you're going to have a good customer base for your little, you know, your little strip mall in the middle of a remote neighborhood.
Yeah. So Travis, I think the question behind the question was around purpose, and how in zoning right now, you can say, okay, it's a single-family dwelling, you can make an estimation on the number of people that are gonna live in that unit, and then from an engineering perspective, you can design everything in behind nice and straightforward, that X number of people are gonna be here, and now we know how much water is needed, is gonna leave, and you can design all that appropriately. And then things like Fort McMurray can happen, where the whole wastewater system in half the city was surcharging because there were way more people in the units than it was designed for. So it can all go to shit anyway. But and that's on video. But the form-based
No pun
zoning,
intended.
right, right. The form-based zoning thing really though is getting at a different purpose of a neighborhood or development or a city. So, I mean, zoning's origins were about keeping people separate, right? And even keeping ethnic backgrounds of people separate. I mean, that's where zoning comes from. But with form-based zoning, there's kind of a reorganization, and it's just an emerging thing really in the planning profession, where you're saying, okay, so let's look at our built environment and what kind of shape, what form do we want structures to take? So what kind of public realm are they creating? And then let's not worry so much about what's happening on the inside. Though there can be some performance criteria where something like a bar maybe isn't gonna fit in, but if it's just about anything else, why couldn't it, right? Like, most basic retail is basic retail. The first zoning bylaw I worked with in Brandon, Manitoba had something like 17 pages of lists of commercial uses, everything from wig shop. Like, my first job was as a development officer. I'm like, okay, yeah, I can do a wig shop. Oh, DVD rentals. Well, that doesn't exist. What do I do? You know, like when new things come up, like it was so archaic, right? But we're really making a move, I think, as whole cities, from prescribing everything to the nth degree to wanting to create places that are more alive and vibrant, which means there's more chaos, it's messy, there's maybe more confusion, and then the way out of that to have some certainty is the form, right? And then what's gonna happen in there. But then there's assumptions to be made from an engineering perspective and how you design the public infrastructure in behind that. But I think Bard made a point earlier about, I mean, we could focus on Anthony Henday or we can focus on whatever the bigger thing is. And I think form-based zoning is actually a symptom of us beginning to talk about what cities are really about and what they're for and how they serve all of us, right?
Just as a further question, philosophically, is it equally sort of glaringly oppressive to prescribe form as it is to prescribe use? Or is there a significant difference where it's, like, do you feel more comfortable prescribing form than use? Or are those still kind of equal?
I think they're quite different. Because when I describe use, I'm getting right into the heart of what's your business. there's all kinds of really nasty questions in it, right? Like in California and Los Angeles, it was let's remove the Chinese laundries to that part of the city because nobody wants to live near them who isn't operating a Chinese laundry. That's not the kind of world I want to live in. There's all kinds of things in zoning bylaws when you talk about use in a single family and a two-family dwelling, and what a family is and how do you define that? Like that's totally different today than it used to be. We've got so many different cultures living in our city that the size of a family can be huge, right? And I remember working in a place, well, in Brandon, Manitoba again, where okay, well, there's a university, and then there's these big houses that are turning into rooming houses, and, well, the neighbors didn't want that. They wanted it to be single-family dwelling. Well, what if you're 4 people living in a building, or you're 4 people living in a building, am I supposed to go out and do a blood test and see if you're, and then where does that take us, right? So it ends up, at the end of the day, like, what is the use in a very general way? In behind maybe what the form is. But they're very two different things, because if you're regulating the form, you're just regulating the size of a building and where it's situated on a lot, but you're not regulating at all the specifics of who's doing what inside, and they're very different.
And it's not just inside though, right? It's, if you have, depending on the type of activity that's happening there, you know.
It's on the land,
You
yeah.
have people driving to the theater in cars, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, so they need a place to park their cars, and that affects neighbors, and, right? And
Yeah.
there's noise, and,
Yeah, or there's, I actually live right off White Avenue
yeah.
in Garneau, and we have, you know, it's an interesting question, because since you asked it and I gave my really flippant response to it, I've been thinking, and in fact, we've had an ongoing dialogue in my neighborhood in Garneau about the increase in bars along 100, and for those of you who are from Edmonton, along 109th Avenue between the High Level Bridge and White Avenue, we are actually seeing an increase in bars. I live half a block in, just across from the City Arts Center. Pardon me? 109th Street, sorry, yeah. And that does have to do with use, right? And when you talk about what's happening inside and what's happening outside, well, Original Joe's is right on the corner, and they have an outdoor patio. So, and that's immediately adjacent to my residential neighborhood, and it's very loud for about 4 months of the year. It's very loud late at night. And so it's one of those balances, you know, we all want activity, we want places to go in our neighborhoods, but it's certainly true that I would not be happy if there was a doubling or a tripling of that kind of activity on that street right near me, because it would certainly have a big impact on myself and all my neighbors. So it's a difficult conversation to have, because it becomes about balance and nuance, right?
And that's a good point too, because it's, in some ways, zoning is a reflection of, you know, the interests of the other residents in the neighborhood. So, because I've run community consultation processes for development projects with my clients, and you know, the residents in the neighborhood are going to be concerned about both aspects. If you have a project that requires any type of variance whatsoever, then the neighbors are going to be interested in, you know, is the building going to block the sunlight into my backyard? And they're also going to be interested in what kind of traffic is going to be coming through here and you know, running into my kids on the street.
And traffic doesn't come from the form of the building.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't
Yeah.
even mean the
Yeah.
vehicle traffic, but it's also, you know, what kind of people are going to be coming through.
What kind of people?
Yeah. Yeah, young, old, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what people are concerned about. So, for example, I had one client who's developing an affordable housing project, and most of the suites were smaller suites. And so the neighbors were all concerned that there won't be any families, so we're gonna have a whole bunch of single people. And it's gonna
Oh,
offset
yeah.
the family balance of our community. We're trying to establish a family neighborhood, and it's evolved in that direction over the last 10 years, and now you're gonna bring in 38 singles. So, you know, that's, people are concerned about that.
Do you want to chime in, or?
I don't think so.
Okay. Does anyone, other than Travis, have a question or a comment? we're not attached to taking this all the way to 340, so we can close. But I wouldn't mind hearing from a couple of you what your perspectives are on public infrastructure. Yes?
I guess the one question that came up in I kept running through my head as you were going through them. To me, the whole question boils down to competing economic priorities. To me, there's no sense investing in infrastructure if you haven't got the social side, and vice versa. And how society puts a priority and economic value on that. To me, as an engineer, my value is infrastructure because it drives my social. But I also think we do a lot of work in small town Alberta that are losing their schools. There's no sense investing in infrastructure if you haven't got your schools. So I just wonder what your guys' thoughts are on those competing priorities.
What do you mean by social?
Well, your cinemas and all that, if you haven't, you need that social, your schools, your entertainment, and those type of social aspects to create a sense of community. And that drives if people are going to go to that area. But you're also going to have the infrastructure to support that.
That's an interesting point in that, we often, at our firm and the work I do, we talk about, it's kind of getting a bit cliche, but we talk about, the three pillars of sustainability. So you've got, economic, environmental, social. So following your thought, though, you're right. When you see there's competing economic priorities, and even if we talk about what we were earlier about, form and land use and all those kind of things, at the end of the day, if there was a bar owner in the room, you'd probably say, hold on a minute, that's what I do for a living, and it needs to be economically viable, so I want, that place on 109th to set up. So you do get this tension between all of it, and at the same time, it all has to work. So if I think you must be touching on smaller communities that are losing some of those fundamental pieces. And, that's a good question. I don't know how you encourage a small community that's losing its school. How do you encourage a movement, if I could use that word, to hold on to that school? Because if you don't have the school, you're not going to have the people moving there. The same holds true actually for the downtowns of our larger cities. There's a number of people that, won't move downtown. They would raise their family in a multifamily or a high-rise tower, but they won't do it if there isn't a school handy. So, and people drag out. I was in New York recently, and you see the kids in downtown Manhattan walking to school, but we're not New York. I would just like to throw one other thing into this, is that I wonder if some of the answer to some of this is about density. And density is a tricky slope, but where there's density, there's an opportunity to get creative. And it can drive the needs of a lot of these things. And there's different arguments about how to create density, but something to think about.
Anything from Eva or Antoine on that?
I mean, it sounds like if you're talking about rural communities, it's this economic spiral that can happen if you have schools and businesses hollowing out in rural communities, and because the activity isn't there, you don't build the infrastructure, and then because the infrastructure's not there, you don't have the
Yeah.
activity.
Yeah.
And so you have this, and it's really an economic question, right? I mean, it's why do the commercial spaces in rural communities hollow out in the first place? So, I've had conversations with colleagues of mine who, there's, in many rural communities, there are some very profitable businesses run by people who have lived in those small towns all their lives. Butcher shops and small, convenience stores that are very profitable as businesses. And the owners of these businesses are getting ready to retire, and they can't find anybody to buy the business. Even at an 8%, 9%, 10% cap rate, they can't find somebody to take the business over from them. It's because, there's it requires a commitment to that community. Someone who's young enough to want to buy a business in that community and wants to stay there for, you know, a period of time that makes sense to make that investment, that's a small market.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so, I mean, that's, that may be, that's a larger question, you know, what,
Well,
as our populations concentrate in urban areas, what does it take for small rural communities to thrive, both in terms of having people in the buildings and then justifying the investment in infrastructure?
Your question made me think about the village my parents live in, which has about 3,800 people. And it is, it's in southern Ontario. It has a very, very strong, actually, arts, cultural, and heritage community, which is almost entirely volunteer-driven. And so I think that one of the things that is possible when you know, communities are looking at how to balance this stuff out and how to use their resources so they can have the best of both in a way, is to find ways of being really encouraging and supportive of any kind of volunteer work that is brought into the community that relates to things like your community arts council or community theater or protection of heritage buildings, because even though it pains me to say it, that is something that with a lot of focus and a lot of dedication people can do with not a lot of resources, not a lot of financial resources, but a lot of human resources. You know, that might be part of the answer for some of the smaller communities is to, and I see that happening actually a lot in small communities. They have a much smaller professional core than the urban centers do, and there's a lot of reasons for that when it comes to the arts and cultural community. But they still have vibrant communities, and they find a way of doing it. The other thing I was thinking about, which kind of is another layer to what you were asking about, is the issue of when we think of, say, Edmonton as a small community relative to many big cities, is the fact that we are actually, we don't do a great job here of keeping excellence in our own communities. We let people go way too easily, and I think whether we're talking about really small communities or mid-sized communities like Edmonton, that has to be a priority if we want to be really vibrant. And it doesn't matter what sector we're talking about, whether it's social sciences or medicine or any kind of research or the arts, we have to find ways of keeping really high-quality people with us.
So maybe just to wrap up, and also I'll conclude with a comment on your question, is it strikes me that the decision on when to make those economic decisions or those financial investment decisions on public infrastructure is a political question, right? Whether it's for the Don Ivesons and the city councilors or at provincial governments or federal governments, because that's where we see infrastructure money move around, that those decisions are inherently political in our pocket of the world, for sure. But the process of making those political decisions regularly, whether it's at the election, involve the citizens, or in the whole campaign process, involve all of our voices. But then also after the election is done and it's just the day-to-day business of government and making decisions on when to allocate things, all four of our voices are involved in some way, shape, or form. So when I have my hat on as a city planner working inside City Hall, I'm part of the machinery that's going to make a recommendation up to City Council. And then all of you guys in the work that you do in many ways has ways of, whether it's asking for funds for support or working with the government in the case of BARD here, there's oodles of political decisions that are underway that necessarily and ought to net all of our voices together to actually provide the public infrastructure, whether it's at the municipal, provincial, or federal government levels, that in theory is giving us all as citizens what we need to thrive, fundamentally. So, okay, and then we'll close. Question or comment, and then we'll close. Yes.
And decisions we have to make, and as engineers, I'm an engineer, and I work in municipal infrastructure, and very much in the area of asset management, which is a new buzzword now, that we're talking about sustainability and thinking about life cycle of all these things.
Yes.
Managing key goals that are there to do what they have to do. But I see a movement right now, moving into our ability, and engineers are lousy at this, we need to learn better, on engagement of the left half of your column there between citizens and society at large. Between civic managers and civic developers, even politicians who are part of our management decision making. Like, what is the basis of the decisions we make? And it's easy for us to probably tell you how much it costs to do something, but we don't know what the citizens or the society is saying about their ability to pay for it, or their willingness to pay for it, which relates to a question from the engineering perspective. Well, what level of service do you want from us? You want roads that are smooth, that are not congested, or wide gravel roads and potholes, or garbage pickup every 2 weeks or only 1 week, and roads that all the sustainability issues that are now coming into the picture are concerns of the community sustainability as well. So the engagement with the public becomes a very, very important piece, and I was quite interested, even as an engineer, to listen to the kind of conversations going on, and I was listening to the left half of the panel to see, your perspectives on this, because as I say, as engineers, we're having to learn how to dialogue. And with that, I don't consider myself a social scientist, but realize that I need to know how to embrace social sciences into the work that we do. So it's more a collaborative issue. On the business of communication, when there, and I've run a lot of, stood in front of a lot of public meetings around infrastructure, some that are highly controversial, and the comment was made earlier about how polarized our decision making seems to always be. People who like it and people who hate it. Like, people who go into meetings like that knowing that half the room is going to hate me and half the room is going to like what I'm saying. And that's life. But to go past that, and a good friend of mine who is a high-end communication specialist has started to teach me that what's wrong with controversy? Like when people are upset and mad, there's passion. So let's go behind that passion. Why is that there? Which talks to about what are my values that I want to impose on here. And at the end of the day, those values have to be measured against what things actually cost. And this is where the tough decisions now come that the politicians ultimately make, but that the two people on the left side of the panel here have to make those people better decision makers. They need to have this information about what the people on the left side are really, truly thinking. And it's not just what are those people, how are we going to get those people's votes? It is about the lifestyle that they can offer them with the decisions they make. So trying to figure out how to get into the whole mix of taking it past the passion and anger and controversy and accepting that as a statement of value, a life value, and what's important to me. And as engineers, I've seen people try to plan with engineering, and I don't think that's right. I think we need to respond to what the planners need and want, which is respond to the community, and I think we've come full circle. So somehow in the mix of these four, there needs to be some mechanisms where we can bring those things together and understand the decisions that are made, and even from a public perspective, the citizen society, understanding what those tough decisions actually are. And I think part of our job is to take more education that way. Okay, you want that? Then these are sort of the cost implications. Are you willing to pay? Are you able to pay? And are you willing to pay? So the debate gets quite complex. It goes beyond engineering. And I think we're entering an interesting period of time where there's going to be a much more closer collaboration of those things. We just can't sit back and make those decisions and say, here's what we're going to do, because here's the policy, and here's the zoning plan, and here's the master plan. I
I think it's going to go past that. So it was just a statement, and just seeing the world migrating into a much more collaborative effort in an area of discomfort for engineers and for developers and for managers. And yet, when people are upset about something, somehow we've got to come to grips with that. Either educate them on what the implications of a tough decision is, or concede that we haven't, thought about it well enough in one fashion or another. Just a few comments or statements that where I see the world happening and moving from my world as an engineer.
Well, thank you, because one of the reasons why I asked these folks to join me was to, at a minimum, just drop in a little snippet of time in your entire conference to just think and look at cities and our relationships amongst the whole city in a different way. And you've just affirmed for me that just seeing those 4 different voices, and in particular hearing these 2, has added value. And that I as a planner, similar to what you were commenting about for engineers, our work is changing quite dramatically because of having to take into account those 2 voices on the left, and they're asking and they're soon demanding for that to happen. And I know these guys want to chime in, so I'm going to let them.
Go
sorry.
Edith. No, sorry.
Well, I do, because thank you very much for that comment, but there is a really important corollary to that, which is that hand in hand with an acknowledgement that the left side has to become more part of the decision-making process is a responsibility from that left-hand side to be informed and to be educated so that we can be good partners with you. And I think this is, we see this now in terms of levels of democratic engagement, for example, where there's a paucity of engagement, true engagement. And what you have a responsibility and a right to do is to ask of us that we educate ourselves about the things that we have to voice opinions about. I actually think that most government, well, our civic government at least, has a lot of information available for the people who care to avail themselves of it. So what I'm saying, it's a 2-way, 4-way street, and you can have a lot of information available for us to make good decisions, but we have to be responsible and process that information and speak to it in a way which makes us good partners for you.
I just, the two observations that you shared, that things seem to be moving in that direction towards more collaboration. That's what I see as well, and also that it's uncomfortable, and that's part of the joy.
Believe it or not.
Well, I'll just make one comment. I know we want to wrap up, and following on the comments you just made. And while it might be uncomfortable, I can tell you as a developer builder, it's welcomed. Because, frankly, in a perfect world, if a community told me I want this, in a perfect world, I would find a way to deliver whatever that this is. And if that could come in a way of what you're talking about, where we get all 4 quadrants talking to each other, I guess it could be uncomfortable, but at the same time, it may be utopian, but it also may be exactly what we need. Because right now, we sit around and think we're bloody brilliant and got great haircuts, but how the hell do we know what people really want without asking them? So, maybe you're onto something in terms of where the shift is going. I agree, there is a shift, you're right. So.
I've come to the realization that over time, we have assigned great responsibility and power to the upper right quadrant there, the city managers. And I don't know how many times if I say to somebody, I meet fresh and, well, what do you do and what do you do? And I'm a city planner, and then they talk, and I'm sure it's the same for engineers. Oh, well, we could sure use some planning here, and then off they go. But we point our fingers at, we pick on lawyers, we pick on engineers, we pick on planners, whatever. But the truth of the matter is, it isn't just the civic managers that build a city, it's all 4 of these voices. That is the bottom line. We don't recognize that fully, I don't think, in much of our public discourse, but that's what I've come to understand and believe. So I would like to thank very much Eva and Antoine and Bart for joining me. I met Eva briefly just over a year ago, and I just had this sense that she'd bring something spectacular to our discussion, so thank you for bringing that. The bios for all three of these people are on the website. They're phenomenal people, so go and check that out. I just didn't want to read it out to you. Antoine and I have met from time to time, and even today when you were starting to talk about the city as an organism, you reminded me why. I'm like, that Antoine's the guy to wear the citizen hat, because he's a citizen fully invested in thinking about what a city is while he goes and makes his way through life. It's all connected for you. And Bard I have just met, but over the years I've heard Bard's name pop up regularly as a developer that's thinking about the whole city that's being assembled while he's doing his work. So he came with great recommendations from some mutual acquaintances. So I've really enjoyed meeting you and hearing what you had to say. And the conference organizers are not giving you a physical gift, but rather they are making a donation to Engineers Without Borders on your behalf. So I wanted to make sure you knew that. So thank you everyone for joining us. This was an unusual panel, but I hope that you felt the same as the gentleman who last spoke about just seeing a different window into a city and a way to look at it from a more whole perspective. And thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and your conference. Thanks.